You think you make logical decisions with your money. The data suggests otherwise. Let's run the numbers. The same outcome can feel different when described as preventing loss rather than creating gain. A reference point can determine whether a result is experienced as improvement or setback. That tension opens a puzzle about structure rather than personal failure. The distinction remains important. Risk can become more attractive when a choice is framed as recovery. The answer begins by examining the route around the choice, not only the outcome. This requires a careful comparison. The desire to protect gains can encourage caution under an equivalent structure. This makes the surrounding sequence part of the decision itself. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Now, the mystery is why identical consequences can produce different emotional weight. The contrast matters because preference and completion are not identical. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Loss and gain frames can redirect attention without changing the underlying options. We can investigate the pattern while allowing responses to differ across contexts. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. A decline from expectation may feel worse than an equal rise feels good. The result can look like weak discipline even when the pathway carries much of the burden. Recent outcomes can shift the reference point used for the next decision. This creates a practical gap between wanting an outcome and reaching it. The distinction remains important. People may defend an earlier position because closing it makes the loss feel final. That distinction prevents us from treating every incomplete action as a revealed preference. This requires a careful comparison. A gain frame can make preservation more salient than opportunity. Inspect the choice architecture. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. A loss frame can make recovery more salient than restraint. Seen this way, the obstacle belongs partly to the environment. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Framing can influence choice without removing agency. The practical stakes appear when the same intention repeatedly meets the same barrier. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Prospect theory evaluates outcomes relative to a reference point. Used carefully, the concept explains a pathway rather than declaring a fixed trait. Individual circumstances can change the result. Loss aversion describes greater sensitivity to losses than comparable gains. This framing preserves room for rational choice, changing circumstances and individual variation. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Risk attitudes may differ across perceived gain and loss domains. The mechanism becomes clearer when the surrounding conditions are named explicitly. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. The reference point can come from purchase price, expectation, habit, or recent experience. A precise definition prevents the label from becoming an overbroad explanation. The outcome is not predetermined. Framing changes classification even when the final outcome remains constant. This definition keeps the analysis separate from moral judgment or guaranteed prediction. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Loss aversion should not be confused with general risk aversion. The distinction matters because adjacent mechanisms can produce similar visible outcomes. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Reference dependence helps explain why context matters to valuation. It also allows a bounded explanation without claiming that everyone responds identically. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. These concepts describe tendencies, not fixed laws for every person. That boundary helps separate structural influence from personal preference. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. A position below its reference point may invite risk-seeking attempts to recover. The immediate experience may therefore outweigh a distant or less visible consideration. This requires a careful comparison. A position above its reference point may encourage protection of the gain. Once repeated, the sequence can become easier to follow than to reconsider. The outcome is not predetermined. Holding a declining asset can postpone acknowledgement without improving its prospects. The practical consequence depends on timing, clarity, and the cost of reversing course. The boundary should remain explicit. Selling a winning asset can secure certainty while limiting future upside. This is one mechanism, not a complete explanation for every financial decision. The surrounding context still matters. Interestingly, the same price can feel expensive or cheap depending on the comparison. The effect may strengthen when motivation is moderate and competing demands are present. Individual circumstances can change the result. Marketing frames can emphasize avoided loss or obtained benefit. A different environment could redirect the same intention through another sequence. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Defaults can make non-action feel like preserving the current state. The relationship is conditional, which is why context must remain visible. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Injureship can shift the reference point and change perceived value. The pathway matters because each stage can either preserve or drain momentum. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Mental accounts can create separate gain and loss frames for identical resources. This helps explain why small design features can have cumulative consequences. The boundary should remain explicit. Salience can intensify whichever side of the reference point is most visible. Defaults influence, they do not determine. The boundary should remain explicit. Individual circumstances can change the result. Regret can become part of the perceived loss even when outcomes are uncertain. This step changes what receives attention before the final comparison is made. Individual circumstances can change the result. Reframing can reveal alternatives, but it can also manipulate attention. The next effect emerges because limited attention must be allocated somewhere. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. A neutral comparison may require multiple frames rather than one preferred description. That shift can alter completion while leaving the available options formally unchanged. This requires a careful comparison. Pre-commitment can reduce reactive risk-taking after losses. The mechanism builds through several small demands rather than one dramatic event. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Decision rules can separate current prospects from past reference points. This creates a pathway from environment to action without implying inevitability. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Some losses genuinely matter more because they threaten safety or obligations. A rational explanation may fit better when real costs or new information are present. The surrounding context still matters. Greater sensitivity can be rational when downside consequences are asymmetric. This limit prevents the concept from becoming an excuse to ignore genuine preferences. Individual circumstances can change the result. Not every reluctance to sell is loss aversion. An intervention can help one person while making the process harder for another. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Transaction costs, taxes, or information may justify holding. The design question must include autonomy, transparency, and who benefits. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Different contexts may produce different reference points. Removing burden is not automatically beneficial when reflection or protection is needed. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. A frame can clarify a consequence rather than distort it. These conditions mark the boundary between support and manipulation. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. The ethical boundary is whether framing supports understanding or exploits attention. The mechanism remains useful only when competing explanations are considered. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The answer is that loss and gain labels change evaluation relative to a reference point. The practical lesson follows from the root, not from blaming the chooser. Individual circumstances can change the result. The asymmetry can influence risk without fully determining the decision. This interpretation preserves both behavioral insight and rational exceptions. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The distinction matters. Multiple frames can reduce dependence on the first description. The final answer is therefore about alignment between intention and design. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Evaluating future prospects can separate current value from the purchase price. This resolves the opening puzzle without claiming that the environment dictates every choice. The outcome is not predetermined. Predefined exit rules can reduce decisions made under loss pressure. The conclusion is structural but still leaves room for agency and changing priorities. The boundary should remain explicit. Comparing outcomes from a common baseline can expose framing effects. The decision can now be evaluated as a pathway rather than a single isolated moment. The surrounding context still matters. Delaying irreversible action can help when emotion is temporarily intense. That answer is stronger when stated conditionally instead of as a rule for every context. Individual circumstances can change the result. Clear alternatives preserve choice while reducing one-sided framing. The mechanism explains influence, not destiny. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. The opening asymmetry resolves when the reference point is made explicit. The opening contrast becomes understandable once the hidden comparison point is exposed. This requires a careful comparison. Ask what outcome is being treated as the baseline. The action remains bounded because different contexts may require different safeguards. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Restate the same choice as both a gain and a loss. The aim is to make the pathway visible enough to evaluate deliberately. The boundary should remain explicit. Separate sunk outcomes from future consequences. That approach supports experimentation without promising a guaranteed financial result. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Compare risk under a common time horizon and objective. Engineer the environment carefully. The outcome is not predetermined. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Use predetermined review rules for positions vulnerable to recovery thinking. Small revisions can be tested before they become fixed routines. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Check whether ownership has changed the valuation standard. The test is whether the adjustment improves clarity while preserving meaningful choice. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Notice when a frame hides an equivalent alternative. A useful change should reduce avoidable burden without hiding trade-offs. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Preserve caution where downside consequences are genuinely unequal. This turns the concept into a review process rather than a single prescription for every context. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. The goal is not to eliminate sensitivity, but to inspect the frame before acting. The useful lesson is to inspect the environment before judging the chooser. Don't fight your brain, engineer your environment. See you next time.